Sorry about that. Um, and also, I'd like to acknowledge, as Odette did, the stewardess of the Oneida Nation and for welcoming us in their territory. Um, I um, I think that what I'm going to do is I have a presentation, and then I will try to move smoothly but swiftly, and I will try also to make eye contact sometimes so that I can check whether we're somewhat moving together or journeying together. And there will be a moment that is much more interactive because, or dialogical, because we're going to watch a couple of clips. Hi, Michelle. And, oh, okay, is this all right in the back? Okay, thank you so much. So I'll start, and I believe I guess I go this way, right? So maybe because of the technological issues, some of the fonts that I used will kind of like show up as they can. They will be transing with us. Who would have thought? Who would have thought? So the presentation, histories, right? Histories matter, particularly when we're thinking about embodiment, the habituation of the body, how we habituate ourselves to dwell in our bodies, but also how we habituate ourselves to um, dwell in the vicinity of our bodies. So what I think the presentation, the presentation is going to take us to think about what does it mean to interrogate, to engage each other's embodiments, our ways of habituating ourselves to dwell in our bodies and to engage how others have habituated themselves to dwell in their bodies. So part of the history of trans embodiments has to do with, of course, personal experience, but it also has to do with what are the categories, right? What are the frameworks, the frames that we use to make sense of this matter that we call our bodies. And some of those categories have been have emerged from struggles for recognition and struggles for legislation that is more inclusive or that points toward a more comprehensive equality, however formal that equality might be. And then the other aspect about the histories of non-conforming embodiments that is important is how those categories that we use to make sense of our own habituations to dwell in our bodies and some other folks' habituation to dwell in their own bodies, those categories travel. They have a history. They have a local history. Some of the history is interpersonal. Some of, how is it that we make sense of each other's embodiment? Sometimes, we are very much used to reading visible identities. But then when you get a little bit more educated, when you develop some type of inclusive competence or intercultural competence to make sense of each other's embodiments, you move a little bit more gingerly so that you kind of like, you gauge, right? How is it that other folks refer to themselves? How do they self-present and how they name that self-presentation? And those categories may come out of that interpersonal exchange, but then also those categories, sometimes, you just go look up on Google, and that's how the category appears in your life. And so it's important also to think about the scales that are involved in those categories and how we make sense of our embodiments. So I think those are the three important aspects in terms of the context for the conversation. One is how we make sense of what we call our bodies as habituations and to dwell in bodies that are socially produced. Second, that we make sense of our embodiments in relation to larger, broader social movements that have fought for categorical, for categories that are more inclusive and comprehensive and more sensitive and sensible. And third, that it's important to pay attention to the connection between the local, the global, and the different scales in which we make sense of our bodies. Now, because of the two type of non-conforming embodiments that I'm going to be talking about, I will say a few things about the regulation and criminalization of non-conforming embodiments as one of those sites where there have been struggles about those categories, about how we make sense of our embodiments and how much the law has shaped those categories. And particularly, I'm just going to briefly talk about two historical contexts of colonial imposition, one in India and one in the Americas. Sorry, great. Just trying to connect with the slide. Okay. So part of the regulation and criminalization of nonconformity has been associated, at least in the Western world, with notions that were brought about or that came about with colonization. And I'm going to give you, the most workable understanding of colonization, such as both the territorial and cultural invasion of one culture over another. And then I'm going to think historically about this process of colonialism, of colonial powers taking over territory and transforming the culture of the invaded or colonized cultures. I'm going to look at that historical context as introducing, particularly since 1492, race as a global classification of all the populations of the world. Race introduced by colonialism as a category that since then has been used to classify all of the populations of the world. And particularly, it has been used to classify all of the populations of the world in two forms at least. One is to differentiate between humans and non-quiet humans, and also to differentiate between those populations that were going to be afforded the privilege of wages and populations that were wageless. So you can think about the plantation economy, and you can also think about indentured servitude as those forms of wageless labor. So once you have come to an understanding of colonialism as introducing race as a category that classifies all of the people of the world, so then you can think about how does that bear on our inhabitation of embodiments? What does it mean for the habituation of that process of dwelling in our bodies to be marked as not quite human? What does it mean to be marked as human and therefore capable of colonizing an other? how does that bear on how you come to understand your body, how we come to make understand of the differences between our bodies. So imagine if some, since in 1492, were conceived as non-human, so much so that they were, and some of the language that I'm going to use is, there may be some type of trigger warning right now in what I'm going to say. So when you think about the auction block under the plantation economy, so you can clearly see that those bodies that were sold and bought, they were genderless in the sense that they were treated neither as women nor as men, because women and men were not sold and bought. They were not objectified that way. So that's just to give you, like a sense of what does that difference means in terms of embodiment. I know that it may take a semester to fully go, tease out what this means, but at least it gives you something that is suggestive. Would you agree with me?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So now I'll give you two of the cases. One is 1516. Most of you are probably aware, I was kind of okay with geography, but most of you may be aware that Panama is somewhere right there where the North American continent and the South American continent kind of like meet. So there's this tiny little thing that is called an isthmus, and is that little piece of land, not quite land, water, where North America and South America meet in that region that we call Central America. So that little piece of land and water was, quote unquote, discovered by, I believe is Balboa, right? But it's not Vasco Núñez de Balboa, one of the Spanish colonizers. When they arrived in that area, as Hamilton is today, was known, well, probably is still today known by Native Americans as Oneida Nation. That region of what is today Panama was known as Cuareca. What happened is that the brother of Núñez de Balboa was sent to try to settle some of the region. And among the Cuareca, they found a group of about 40 members of the Cuareca community that were known to practice what today we would call anal sex. And they were also known to engage in other forms of cultural practices that included the transformation of their tone of voice into a very high pitch. So when the colonizers arrived, they, because of the Catholic upbringing and the Catholic ideology that they brought with them, they understood that to be nefarious, to be a sin. And what do you think they did with these 40 members of the Cuareca community? As the engrave from, I think the engrave is Theodore de Bry, a Dutch artist who in 1560 something, from the chronicles, from the accounts of the chronicles, created this visual representation, where, as you can see, what is happening. The members of the Cuareca community, which I call the Cuareca 40, were thrown to the dogs to be devoured by them. So I'd like to suggest that that moment is a pivotal moment in the understanding of non-conforming embodiments for the Americas, but particularly not so much because it perpetuates or reinforces the difference between human and non-human, but rather the difference between non-human animals, such as the dogs, and something else, because they are being devoured, eaten up by dogs. So it's not just the human and the non-human, but rather the non-human animal and now some other form of embodiment. And I know that you would like to say, well, but they were humans. Well, that's what the point that I'm trying to make to you, is that we are not anything but through the production of social relations, through the production of our embodiments. So that's how the embodiment of the indigenous peoples of what we call today Central America, of the Cuareca Nation, that's how it was produced at that moment. Among other alternatives, of course, and we have to look at how power relations worked. But at least one of the ways in which those bodies, non-conforming bodies, were produced was through this act of, it's some form of quote-unquote cannibalism, because the colonizers are also deploying the dogs as they have weaponized the dogs in their colonial quest. So the second is what is known as the, so I've shown you one case of the what is known as the long 16th century, right? Long, I don't know if I get it, yeah, the long 16th century. And now I'm going to show you like the second wave of imperial powers, such as the British, the French, the Dutch, and this one is from India. And hijras, we're going to learn a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But hijras, you can think about hijras as members of Muslim and Hindu communities, collectivities, who have chosen to practice the ablation, the castration, ablation of penises as part of the way in which they enter in social cultural arrangements that are religious, spiritual, and economic arrangements. And through that modification of their bodies, they have been recognized as having, in both Muslim and Hindu communities, the ability or the talent or the gift to bestow prosperity upon newlyweds and new enterprises. But in 1864, 84? Oh, 84. Okay, thank you, Odette. Thank you. So in 18, yeah, but I think it's 18, I think the section 377 of the Indian Penal Code was introduced under British rule in India, and it criminalized all forms of sexual, quote unquote, non-conforming embodiments that were not marked as useful for reproduction. So if they were involved in relations that wouldn't be capable of fertilization and pregnancy, then they were marked as criminal. And they were ousted. And they were condemned. They were given horrible sentences if they were found to be members of one of these communities. So in one of the cases, for instance, Queen Empress versus Kairati, you see here what kind of evidence, anatomical, physiological evidence was used to criminalize hijras. A distended anus and signs of syphilis were used to establish the non-normative sexuality of the subject and ascertain their criminality. So think about now another moment in which colonial rule through legislation, so it's no longer as raw, as crude as what I showed you in the prior slide, but now the regulation and the very production of the embodiment has kind of like sifted or kind of like sipped into the legislation, has made it into the law. So now the police can go and check your anus. That's kind of what seems to have been happening in colonial India. When do you think Section 377 was abolished? Oh, well, you know it. Okay.
Well, it was abolished in 2009, recriminalized in 2013, and then decriminalized in 2018.
In 2018. What's your name?
Jerry.
That sound could tell us what we're talking about, but also what it means, right, for the production of embodiments, right? Decriminalization, recriminalization, but nonetheless, even if it was just 2009, it's 150 years. When do you think, quote unquote, homosexuality was decriminalized in the United States? 2004. What is your name? Madison? Great. So maybe these are, right, part of the after effect, the legacy of these forms of colonialism, these forms of differentiating bodies based on the classification of all the peoples of the world in terms of humans and non-humans. So far, so good. Yeah. So now I'll try to move a little faster. So it seems that we're doing kind of okay. So now the point that I'm going to try to make is the following. Is that for those of us who are somewhat connected with what's happening in this building, that we are committed, right? We are committed to seeing things a little different. And that's why you are in the WGS classes or the LGBTQ classes or other forms of social justice oriented classes. It's like we tend to think of ourselves as having the right kind of like, disposition, right? And sometimes we really want to be down, right? So we really want to wow, right? It's like, what is that word? Walk, right? Walk, right? It's like, but then the problem, right, is that it ends up also kind of like taking over us, like, right? It's like who's more down and who's gonna get the, right, the snaps. And that is part of a disposition that is not just about, really fighting for transforming the structures of injustice, but then it is also about how that struggle makes us feel in terms of how we stand in the world in front of each other. In terms of kind of like, whether or not you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, whether or not, right, you are connected or not to struggle that many others could stand for or could go for. And now I find that to be really lovely and also truly, truly commendable. But at the same time, because we are partly produced by that history that we talked about the distinction between the human and the non-human, I'm really very concerned about the many well-meaning people who are not always aware of how the distinction between the human and the non-human bears on what we feel about what we're supposed to do when we are in front of those who embody non-conforming sexualities, non-conforming psychologies, non-conforming economies. So how does that make you feel? How does that difference make you feel? The difference between and among your embodiment and their embodiments. And I have come to see that particularly when it comes to what the West calls transgender, we tend to kind of look at the transgender phenomenon as, well, we understand this is either who they were meant to be or this is who they choose to be. I understand that, and maybe my commitment has to do with accepting or creating environments or context where acceptance can happen. And part of that disposition to behave toward trans population that way has to do with kind of understanding that they had been through those processes that we've been talking about. They have been, or we have been, injured or harmed. So what is it that we want to do? We want to do good by them. Does that make sense? So I have some concerns about that goodness. Why? Because I believe that what we just saw about folks being thrown, native folks being thrown to the dogs to be eaten up, and what we just saw about the anuses being searched and researched, that still lives with us, with you, within you, among us. And unless we become decolonial practitioners of feminism and transfeminisms, they will continue being there. So no matter how many good intentions we have, unless we unlock, we unpack, we tease out the legacy of the distinction between the human and the non-human, we may be doing some type of social justice work, but that doesn't mean that the social justice work that we're doing is a decolonizing form of social justice work. And how does that play out for the transgender experience? So that's what sorry that I have to now move a little faster. Right. So now I'm going to give you like a short account of a theory about cultural differences that I follow. So this legacy of colonialism, the distinction between the human and the non-human, I believe that it impinges upon our cultural dynamics. So much so that you can think about white-centered, Euro-centered, Euro-American dominant culture as operating as a form of monoculturalism. As a form of monoculturalism, as an operation of cultural domination, whereby non-dominant culture is simplified. Kind of like, well, you know, they do not, quote unquote.
It's a test, I think.
What is it?
It's a test of the emergency system, so.
Okay, you sure it's a test, or should we check?
Probably the safest place to be.
Okay, great. So, is the where were we? So, is simplified in the sense that, right, when you look at the case of this, the Cuareca 40, the quote-unquote sodomites, the quote-unquote homosexuals who were thrown to the dogs, how is their culture simplified in that moment? How is it simplified? That's what I want you to think about. Then, how is it discredited as insignificant? Doesn't anal intercourse doesn't it have some meaning other than the nefarious meaning that Catholicism imposed upon it? And finally, how is it that that type of violence, monocultural, Eurocentric violence, how does it render non-dominant cultures ornamental? Something that could or could not exist, that you could live with that, without, or inconsequential to your life. So I want us to think about how this dynamic, this Eurocentered dynamic, is related to how we come to make sense of non-normative embodiments across intercultural relations. Because in this room, there are several cultural histories, several cultural genealogies, several cultural legacies about embodiment. So why is it that even though we truly mean well for the transgender folks, we have erased their non-normative embodiments and their understanding of non-normative embodiments unless we can see them through the filter and the lens of transgender? So I argue in my book that transgender is a colonial imposition. It's a category of colonial domination. And that is something really hard to deal with and to work through. But it's suggested. So I'll just maybe read this to you because there are like questions so that we can get to the clips finally. What are we to do as trans-identified and allies to the transgender movement with the affects, the emotions, the feelings that we inhabit when we encounter the embodied histories of the Cuareca 40 and of hijras? What are we to do? And what kind of emotional labor you are performing or engaging with when you meet non-conforming folks and immediately you try to have them fit into the LGBTQIA P plus acronym, or what I would call the LGBTQ biomaterialities. That biomateriality is produced through processes of cultural domination and through processes of colonial legacies. So they probably hide so much more than what they reveal, even though we use them in order to advocate and to fight for more inclusion. Yeah, they are, remedies. They are remedies. They are remedial reforms. They're fine. But that doesn't mean that they're going to transform all the structures of injustice in our society. So now let's look at the gaycation. Am I already out of time? No, I'm not out of time. I'm okay. So just a little work. So has anyone seen this show, Gaycation? Yeah. Yes. Well, it's kind of cool, right? It's kind of like this study abroad 2.0, right? It's like social justice tourism. Like you're going to go, you're going to learn about somebody else's culture, and it's going to enhance your competences, to your competence to deal with different cultures. But this part of the study abroad 2.0 is connected with gender and with LGBTQ culture around the world. I mean, at least that's how the show sells itself, right? The title already tells you, gaycation. And these two darlings, Ellen Page and Ian Daniel, like they really truly wrote about it, right? Because it's like they put their money into this, right? And you think, wow, right? It's really so cool. They are so social justice oriented and minded folks, right? And then you still want to ask the questions that are the hard questions. So let's see what happens when they go to India on season 2 of the show. So now I have to move to here. No, where is it? Here. So apologies for the subtitles that I believe that they are in Italian because my computer couldn't be connected. But at least, do you think the volume is going to work?
Yeah.
Please don't shut down the air conditioning. I just wanted to know your opinion about what you think the biggest differences are in the movement in America and the movement here. I see the issues and the way you dealt with them is totally different. When you're gay lesbian, you don't really form part of the mainstream. You come out, and that's how you have a gay subculture because you are really not wanted in the family. But here, the gay and lesbian children are left behind because children are a social treasure. So we have to contend with a more conservative movement. Even today, they do not identify here. They say, are you this way?
It's widely stated that you were the first person to say I'm gay. Yeah. And maybe you could just give us some context for that.
I was a journalist for approximately 28 years. And since then, I've been in activism. It's been a bitter fight, both with the government and within the community. Because within the community, they're very divided. The women's issues are totally different. Whereas the violence against the men is in public spaces, where men are cruising. For women, the violence is in the domestic sphere. It's in closed spaces. That's where their oppression takes place. There is a streak of misogyny.
Sorry. So now I go back to the presentation. So now this is the part where I ask for your help, where we start to kind of work together. Would you be? Yep. Good. Good to go. Okay. Good. Would you be kind enough to work with me? That would be the question.
I'm running a microphone for folks so we can all hear.
So, what do you think when Ashok Rokhavi, who is the head of the Hamsafar Fund, an organization that has done great work, particularly on HIV and AIDS awareness in India, and as he said, was the very first public figure to ever come out as gay. So, what do you make of that moment when he says, well, in the West, you kind of come out and you have a gay culture, but here in India, we haven't had that yet. And we have a different type of model where we have to deal with the conservative elements of the gay culture. And he says, they don't even say gay. They say, are you that way? What did you notice about that moment from Ashok Rokhavi? How did that make you feel? Yes.
Hold it a little far away.
It just reminds me of who has privilege and being comfortable and having the freedom in identifying a certain way And I think that it's always that people that it's people. Hold on, I'm saying it usually comes with white privilege because people that do not have like history of being colonized have the privilege and being able to have more freedom and identifying themselves in ways that maybe people of color do not.
What is your name?
Julie, my name is Julie.
Julie. Great. So what about the wonderful? Thank you so much. Thank you. You want to add something?
Yeah, I just recently learned that the Me Too movement was started by someone, by a black woman earlier before it was started by famous actresses that stood up, and that made me enlightened about the people that people that are given credit and starting certain things, and it makes me think hey, who do we give the right to, the credibility of who do we give freedom to in being who they are and who yeah.
So, Julie, let me work with some of what you have contributed to the conversation. Thank you. And I think you brought up this issue of how privilege bears on what we can see or what we cannot see. And it seems that part of the how privilege is working in at least his intervention is that he seems to be connected with the idea that gay as an identity is a possibility for more freedom. That seems to be the case. But yet, at the same time, he's marking a distance between what he sees as the possibility of more freedom by coming out as gay and the local, quote unquote, more conservative gay culture, he calls it gay. And then that moment when he says, well, they don't even call themselves gay. Now, the question to me would be, the activist is from India. He may occupy, in terms of caste and in terms of social class, a privileged position in India. But it seems also that he is very much comfortable with the notion of gayness as a possibility for more freedom. And he doesn't seem to see much of that possibility in the local community who call themselves this way. So that's what I want to have us, think about. How does that make you feel? Yes, go ahead.
So I was thinking that in the Persian culture, you also say this way, and it's funny because when I first moved to the U.S. and I learned about the word gay, I didn't know that there was an actual word for it in Farsi, and all my life I your parents are oh, there was this guy in the shop and he was that way, and you just know that means I didn't even know it was a concept. I didn't know being gay was a concept until I got here, and I was like, what the hell is a gay? What's a gay? I don't know what that is. And it's just really hard because I imagine that the role that your family plays in Eastern cultures, the role that the family plays in your identity. Because if you don't grow up knowing that there's a word for what you're feeling, you just grow up feeling really awkward. I just imagine the first time my mom was because all my friends just happened to be gay, and she's like, "You're not that way, are you?" And I was like, "Okay."
That's lovely. I think this is the conversation that I want us to do. It's lovely. But let me give you, let me respond to you and maybe give you an insight about how I have felt in that situation. And in that situation, I grew up in a very small place in the Andean Mountains on the border between Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. And that word, gay, I didn't grow up with that word either. But I did grow up with many words that were slurs, and that they were, they were used to make me cry, to make me feel bad about myself, about how I behaved. I don't know if about who I was, but certainly about how I behaved. And one of the things that I also experienced is that, for instance, my father, who was a peasant, he had the type of values that did not have a word for what the kind of experience that you're describing or the kind of experience that I had. So even though many of my classmates had a word for me, that was one of those slurs, my father did not. And by not having that word, he allowed me to do so much more than kind of like asking me whether you have a girlfriend, because I grew up as a, whether or not it's noticeable, I grew up as a cisgender boy, right? And or designated male at birth. And while I was growing up, certainly I never quite felt right like aligned with that designation, but it was also true that by my father being so much more suggestive rather than pointing out, oh yeah, you are what the kids say you are, or by saying, well, no, you are something really positive and we have a word for that, who could be gay. By not having either, he allowed me a great degree of experimentation. So it's not always the case that because you have the word that makes you more, freer, that gives you more latitude to experiment. Actually, what's happening there is the opposite. Is that the activist is telling the local conservative community that they should be gay. And there's like a little smirk. And it was so funny that they did not show what Paige and Daniel did at that moment. Because you rarely smirk, you rarely kind of like smirk unless you see it confirmed in front of you. So it was interesting that the editing let that out. And then they immediately go to the next question. So I think that gayness and all of these LGBT acronyms that to me are very much Western centered, they have traveled. And the privilege sometimes, the privilege is whether or not you have access to that global identity that is LGBTQ identity. And when you have access to those identities, it says that then you engage in simplification, in simplifying the local, quote unquote, more conservative, question mark, cultures, and they get to be discredited or disregarded as they don't fit the LGBTQ model of biomaterialities. Good. So now I'll give you like my take on this, right? So Rokavi argues that gay identity relates self-affirmation, societal change, and acceptability. Second, that all histories of heterosexism are going to produce homophobia. The history of heterosexism in the peasant community of my dad didn't make him homophobic in the way that you would visibly identify homophobia. So I want you to think about that. I want you to think about how not all histories of heterosexism produce homophobia under the same guise. The moment of comparison. Why is the moment of comparison so dangerous? Because in order to make comparisons, what do you need? What do you need in order to make comparisons? What? Bodies and a criteria. So whose criteria is at the center of the comparison between and among bodies? Whose criteria? No matter how well-meaning you may be, whose criteria is at the center, given the legacy of colonialism that I have described? Well, in this one we actually analyzed. Six-pack band a band of hijras from India who had become an international sensation. I mean, their cover of that, what is that song, Happy? Pharrell Williams, Happy? Their cover of that song got on YouTube like 35 million views. It's like humongous, right? So and now they are being in, yeah, they had been deployed by the local movement as the local LGBT movement as the transgender moment, the moment of transgender visibility in media. And Ellen Page and Ian Daniel, well, this one I won't go into this, sorry. I can send that to anyone who's interested. And maybe I'll just show you, I'll show you a clip. You think we have like 3 minutes? So I'll show you the second clip and that discussion maybe. Is there going to be Q&A?
Yes.
Okay, so that part of the discussion we can do in the Q&A. But I'll show you at least the second clip, which is much more complicated. And hopefully you've enjoyed a lot so far that you want to ask the questions. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. Bless you. I think.
With millions of views on YouTube, the band has gained attention in part because the members are neither male nor female, but a third gender. Their singles describe the struggles that they face on a daily basis, being part of India's Hijra community. Hijras are considered one of the oldest recorded third gender communities in the world, dating back to Hindu scriptures. And yet today, they are often relegated to the fringes of society with little options. Komal, one of the band members, has invited us to her home where she lives in a Hijra community.
ये एक बंदरपाड़ा इलाका है जहाँ पर मैं रहती हूँ। दूसरे हमारे लोग यहाँ पर ये जो हिजरा कम्युनिटी है इसमें बहुत सारे लोग रहते हैं यहाँ पर। मैं आपको मिलाना चाहती हूँ उनसे आप बात कीजिएगा। Okay, you go first. I'll be right there. Thank you. Has everyone lived here for a long time? मैं तो ये बोलना चाहूँगी कि मैं 8 साल के थे तब हमारी जो एक हिजरा रानी है जो हमारी हेड है यहाँ पर शहर
Who is the head of the community?
ये उनके चेले नाती पोती ये सब
These are all her followers, daughters. We are like a family.
Talk about just the history of those in India who don't, conform to a specific gender, identify with male or female, and what that means in Indian culture, and if it's changed over time.
The Hijra community has been in existence even in the ancient scriptures, and people they respected us. This is my concern in terms of years. No, there have been no changes, not that I can see. For me, Six Pack Band has brought about a new change, but I can only speak for myself there. But in the Hijra community, you still see.
Why do you think people think this disrespect?
Because of the way society. Okay, sorry about that.
पर वो लोग समाज
Take
के
your
डर की
judgment
वजह
in
से आज
society.
हमारे पास डर डर कर
Even now, when they visit, they are skeptical. Tamara, don't cry. If it took your parents this long to understand, think how long it will take the public.
अपन अपने को
Our
समझने
lives
के
are
लिए
such
अपनी
that
हिंदुओं की कहानी ऐसी है कि वो जिंदगी
the
में खत्म
history
नहीं
of
हो
the
सकती
Hindu
मैं बताना
community
चाहता
is,
हूँ
it will take a long time to
Does
explain.
not fit into the LGBT community in India and the current movement for equality and acceptance.
जो आप लोग
We are not part of the LGBT community.
हम लोग को कोई
When we
दुकान
tell
में हम
people
जाते
where we
हैं
come
जब
from,
हम उनको बताते हैं हमारा जन्म एक ऐसा बोलते हैं
we
कोई
are
नर
neither
ना
male nor
नारी
female.
इसमें हम हैं
We have both traits of male
अंडा
and
नर
female.
नारी इसमें हम लोग बसे
We
हुए
are
हैं।
somewhere in between.
Although deeply marginalized, Hijras are accepted as part of India's national identity.
So about this, the only thing I would say now that we're going to switch to the Q&A is what are the things to pay attention to? One would be the question, what does gaycation convey? What does it convey about hijras? And the way in which the community was framed was through the category. What category? What was the first category they said, they mentioned? Third sex and third gender. The second is that they have always been there, even in ancient scriptures. That they live somewhat in some type of community where they have a grandmother. And at least in response to the question of how are you connected to LGBT equality or the movement for LGBTQ equality, what was the answer?
They're not.
They're not. So that's what the show conveys. Then I want you to think about what does it hide, particularly now that you have this framework about the differentiation between the human and the non-human, the West and the non-West. What does it hide? And I'll tell you 3 or 4 things like this in the Q&A. So one is that first, it is the Hindi is translated into English, and it distorts. It never gives you the terms that they are using. It's like everything is being rendered into something that is familiar to you. It's simplified. When they say we are neither male nor female, that's not what they're saying. They're saying we are where we come from. We inhabit. By saying honey. We inhabit half male, half female. Not even like a concept like male or female, but an approximation. Not a concept like male or female, a dichotomous anatomical difference, but half male, half female. And that is a very loose translation that is probably doing some type of violence to the Hindu terms that they use. Then there's never one single mention of their practices as Muslim and Hindu practices. That's the community they belong to. And this house, when they said the grandmother, you could never understand that the grandmother is a Hijra herself, because you're using this term that is a kinship term in English that has nothing to do with the Hindu term for the Hijra grandmother. So anyway, so those are the few things, but just to show you how it is simplified, distorted, and also rendered ornamental. But all through the affection of social justice. Great, so thank you.
If anyone has any questions, thinking of them as folks transition that have to go.
Thank you so much for all of you who stayed until now.
The commitment, yes, okay.
Hi, I want to start by saying thank you. This was incredibly interesting and also really, really important. Talking a little bit about the gaycation clip, discussing sort of like the concept of gay, this sort of Western concept. I feel like oftentimes gay is used as a sort of political identity to try and gain traction and to try and like gain political acceptance, sort of drawing off of that 1969 Stonewall sort of rebellion, the way gay worked in the U.S. to gain acceptance. Oftentimes people think that's their next step in gaining acceptance where they're like in their home countries. But could you speak a little bit more on how that erasing factor that using gay has and how the homonormativity and how the whiteness and all of the aspects of gay can have such a negative and detrimental impact on people who attempt to use it for political growth or...
Thank you so much. What was your name?
Jake.
Jake, thank you. Well, the issue, right, that I'm trying to raise is that some of us have become increasingly aware that this is a problem, that there is such a thing as homonationalism, that there is such a thing as homonormativity, that gay becomes some type of a colonial imaginary, right? Like an ideology about how to go about the struggles for LGBTQ acceptance and inclusion. So there is that critique, but maybe the part that I invite you to read the chapter on that book that you mentioned, the Speaking Face to Face, that is called Beyond Benevolent Violence, because what I want us to think about is that sometimes we make sense of something analytically, but then we don't quite grasp what it means for us viscerally in our affective body, in the sense that part of what it means to get traction on something is that we want to do well. And I want to explore what does that mean, that you feel that you are doing well or that you are doing good by those that you want to uplift. So I think that that's what is problematic about this dynamic, the colonial legacy of these dynamics. And particularly in terms of how it erases other forms of struggle. Why? Because when, any of you who are interested in this kind of work, and then you do it either politically as an activist, and you're creating knowledge as an activist for a community, you're creating different strategies and techniques and tactics in order to interact with each other. You may be engaging in these forms of violence so that you don't get to see what part of a wisdom we are missing or erasing or disregarding or distorting. So for instance, in Latin America, in Brazil, and in Argentina, for instance, Argentina has the second most comprehensive gender identity bill in the world. It was only second to Canada in passing a same-sex marriage legislation. And only Malta has a clause about intersex that Argentina's gender identity bill doesn't. So Argentina is one of those places where trans folks can access trans healthcare just by going to the doctor and presenting, by claiming that they are trans or non-binary or non-conforming. So they can access services, they can access documentation, they can have a new birth certificate just because they present as such. They don't have to go to a doctor, they don't have to get a diagnosis of any kind. So no doctor or clerk of the state are going to tell you what gender you are. So now, who were at the forefront of these struggles? Travestis. and they do not define themselves as transgender. Just as Komal said, well, we're not part of that community. That's the first thing that she said. We're not part of that community. So that's the kind of history, genealogy, wisdom that we may miss, we may erase if, on the one hand, we're trying to make it fit into the acronyms that we have available to us, and the we is a very loose we. And then on the other hand, is that then LGBTQ biomaterialities learn very little about how they could be otherwise because of that impoverishing of how we look at the struggles. So it's good that you're aware that that's one of the ways in which some communities get traction, but at the same time you have to think about how just or unjust that traction may be.
We have time for one more. If anyone has anything else they'd like to add or share or ask. Anyone?
I'm trying to think what my question is, but yeah, I needed a second to think through this question. But in the case of say Argentina, where it's hard, like again, like the good intentions, right? It's hard to hear that, like, oh, Argentina allows A, B, C, and then not say that that's good. But what is being erased? Like, right? Like, why might we also want to be reluctant to celebrate these rights? Like, right? Like, have I'm just trying to. Like, in what ways is that also the imposition of making yourself, your body, legible to the state? And should we reject the struggle for rights all around?
Awesome. So, well, I wouldn't want to, I wouldn't like to leave the room with the idea that fighting for rights and for formal inclusion is not useful. I think it is useful. I think it's useful, but in that sense, we could also think about how to radicalize those struggles. Because, for instance, I would like to share my health insurance with all the couples I have, with all the partners I have, or I would like to have. It's not that I have that many. The people who know, they know that. Very boring. Very boring. So, but, right, I would like that, right? I would like. So why is it that marriage, and now it's becoming after same-sex marriage equality, it has become worse because many of the states that had domestic partnership legislation, they no longer have it. So that means that you have to get married. You have to get married if you want those benefits. So you see how what it looks like an equal rights victory, then it becomes a regulation of marriage. Really, that's what it is. Of who gets to play house. So I kind of agree, and then I can talk particularly in the case of Argentina that some of the most visible advocates that I have worked with for several years, or are a friend of mine, such as Marlene Guayar and Susie Shock, they have not obtained a birth certificate with the designation of I was born what, female, or with the because there were for several reasons. But then also because it's a way of claiming that it's important to have it as part of equal formal equality at the same time that you recognize that it's a remedy that doesn't radically transform the structures of injustice. Because today and yesterday, in the last 5 years, they have fought for making visible travesticide, the specific type of physical violence and psychological violence against the travesti community. And we're also fighting for what is known as the cupo laboral. That is a type of equal opportunity legislation or affirmative action legislation at the workplace, so that every single agency of the state has to meet a minimum of travesti employment, that each agency should have a percentage. It's about restorative justice in a way. But then when you look at how it happens on the ground, they go for the cupo laboral, right, for this type of affirmative action as a, it's groundwork to actually transform the imaginaries rather than, okay, what are they going to do? They get, some of the cities now have this legislation. And what job do you think they get? What kind of jobs do you think they get? Cleaning, secretarial work, which are all very dignified, but they are certainly have life experience, political experience, and some of them also, with a lot of effort, they have the college degrees. But those are the positions that are available. So what they're doing with this fight for the cupo laboral travesti, what they're doing is actually trying to transform. What are the categories through which we make sense of how we have denied them as a society economic justice? So they're talking about restorative justice. They're talking about they talk about the childhoods that have been lost. And how are you going to put a dollar number on them? Taking the model of some civil rights, such as the African American community in the US, and also in the international courts, right? Because they've taken their cases to the international courts. So it's about transforming the conversation and making sense of the debasing, dehumanization of non-conforming embodiments. So yeah, I agree. It's not just about the state. It's about transforming the state, sometimes from within and sometimes in that interaction between social movements and state. So I've talked for so long. Thank you so much.
Thank you again. This was wonderful and a wonderful way to open the semester. If folks have time, I would appreciate some help stacking all of these chairs. I'll bring the holders out. And thank you all again for coming.
And I'm telling you, you are great. That you have some. I don't know if you brought many professors brought their students, but in Syracuse, if we get 30 folks, we are super happy. So you rock.
So it's probably going to be my students. I messed up the dates.
Oh yeah.
For what the presentations were. So the students thought they were coming to a consent around there today. But got a good conversation that they probably would have showed up for, which I'm happy about. But I'm also like, it was probably going to be funny. Like they're I mean, but it was about consent in a way. I mean, it's just like.
Yeah, colonialism happens with consent.
Absolutely not.
Let's start there.
They go in the front. Drag it to the front.
Just make it more stacks of four. I love it.
That was the best. Like,
how many chairs have you left out?
I was like, ooh.
8 chairs have you left out.
Wait, 6? Because there's 2 rolly chairs.
Okay, 6 chairs have you left out.
6 of these chairs and then 2. We're so smart.
I like it. I like it.
These two have already been. There's only 4 left that need to be.
One more. There's one chair. Kylie, number 4 on. That'll be number 4. Perfect.
Okay,
I'm thinking or maybe a coffee.
we just started.
All of your sources.
I messed up the topics for this week and next week, and so my students got a dose of transgender, and they thought they were coming to a consent conversation, which it was about consent around loneliness, but you know what I mean. But I was like, I was happy because I feel like some students my early morning was just kind of we're intersectional feminists. I was like, let's unpack the word intersectional feminist, so that group then has a particular level. It has. So when I saw the numbers today, and I was like, yes, I was like, I invited you. It's a mistake, but it was a good mistake. It was good. Not a mistake.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
This should have been. That's great.
Yeah, you remind me. I have a. You remind me.
Oh, yeah, it was. Oh, no, I'm surprised.
It says
I'll see you back. Right.
Is there
I don't know, I might not be able to do this tonight. I have to get my work out. If I can get my work no, dude, my workout is great. I do it, but that's what I'm saying. I gotta try to do the workout before. Yeah, only that's the only way I can keep it down. I mean, not the I'll see you in my
Space.
Yeah, I remember that. Yes.
I always just hope I don't be late.
Have you got that space?
Can I be late to class to go to Stern's office hours? Oh, I just miss him.
that's just too much reason. He's here.
Oh,
no, the answer to that question is already Southampton.
Oh, come on, he's still in there. Yes. I just don't want to. I don't want to like shimmy on it and be like, oh hey, Stern. I'll be like, I'm the office hours now.
Through the presentation, I felt realized that I needed that.
Then you ask your own question.
At one point,
I tend to frown. And then halfway through, you're like,
Oh, I don't need you to be very
thinking things. Oh, that's great. That's fabulous. You know, attention also works that way, right?
I'll tell you. You look like you're on the struggle bus.
I am so on the struggle bus. I got to rip my.
How cool.
I'm
also on the
stuff, but you also gave us a good
I'm trying to decide if I should even like try to go to class or if I should just
Our alumni communities are the communities. So I want to have a conversation with our alums and some folks from the community. So you gave me the language.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You'll hear from me.
Thank you for the invitation. And let me know more of what you need from me for the
What I'm going to do this weekend is write you individuals on the panel to give us get you in touch with the around, and then maybe 2 or 3 prompts. And then we're going to okay, so hopefully this weekend.
Keeps on
Imagine all of this.
I'm happy it's also just like,
Yeah, but I was like, I can imagine like, at least as you were saying, the first one was
yeah, well, so much more.
The gender binary. So it's like